Hello there, and welcome to Whispered Knowledge. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, settling in for this exploration of the mind. Maybe you've been pondering the nature of your own mind, or perhaps you're simply seeking a gentle journey into one of existence's deepest mysteries as you wind down for the evening. Either way, you've come to the right place. Let your breathing slow, your muscles soften, and your thoughts drift as we explore something extraordinary. Tonight, we're venturing into consciousness itself, that strange, shimmering phenomenon that allows you to experience these very words, to feel the weight of your body, to know that you exist at all. Think about it for a moment. Right now, as you listen, there's something it's like to be you. You're not just processing information like a computer. You're experiencing it. There's a felt quality to your existence, a subjective interior that no one else can access directly. When you see the color blue, taste chocolate, or feel pain, these aren't just neural signals. They're experiences, sensations, feelings that have a particular character, a unique what-it's likeness that defines your inner world. This is consciousness, and despite centuries of investigation by the brightest minds in philosophy, neuroscience, and physics, we still don't truly understand how or why it exists. Consciousness is the most intimate thing you'll ever know, yet it remains the most elusive mystery in all of science. It's the felt quality of being you, the theater of your inner life, the inexplicable something that transforms electrical signals in your brain into the rich, vibrant experience of living. It's the difference between a universe that simply exists and one that knows it exists. It's the strange loop where matter has arranged itself in such a way that it can contemplate itself, where the universe has evolved structures capable of asking, "Why am I here?" Over the next few hours, we'll wander through 100 remarkable facts about consciousness, from the neural networks that seem to generate it, to the philosophical puzzles that have stumped the greatest minds, to the surprising discovery that awareness might be far more widespread in nature than we ever imagined. We'll explore how your brain creates the unified experience you call self, from billions of independent neurons, how consciousness can be measured and manipulated, what happens to awareness during sleep and anesthesia, and whether other animals share your inner life. We'll delve into the hard problem of consciousness, the profound question of why physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience at all. We'll examine theories ranging from the scientifically rigorous to the speculative, from integrated information theory, which attempts to quantify consciousness mathematically, to quantum theories suggesting awareness might involve exotic physics. We're only beginning to understand. We'll look at what happens when consciousness breaks down in coma patients, in split-brain individuals, in people with disorders that fragment or eliminate aspects of awareness. Some of what you hear tonight might challenge everything you thought you knew about minds and brains. Other facts might simply deepen the mystery, opening questions rather than closing them, and that's perfectly fine. The study of consciousness is still in its infancy, a frontier where neuroscience meets philosophy, where empirical evidence dances with ancient wisdom, where the observer and the observed collapse into one. We stand at the beginning of what might be the most important scientific endeavor in human history, understanding the nature of experience itself, the ground of everything we know and are. Before we begin our journey, if these explorations help you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others discover these quiet investigations into the nature of reality, one curious mind at a time. Now, let your attention settle. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the questions wash over you like gentle waves, and let's begin to explore what it means to be conscious. to exist as a point of view in a vast universe, to be the strange phenomenon of matter that is awakened to its own existence. The mystery begins. Fact 1. Consciousness is the only thing you can be absolutely certain exists. Everything else, the external world, other minds, even the reality of time and space, can be doubted. But the fact that you are having an experience right now, that there is something it is like to be you in this moment, is undeniable. This was the insight that led philosopher René Descartes to his famous conclusion: I think, therefore I am. You might be a brain in a vat, dreaming in a simulation, but you cannot doubt that the experience itself is happening. Consciousness is the foundation of all knowledge, the bedrock of certainty in an uncertain universe. Fact 2. No one can fully agree on what consciousness actually is. Despite being the most immediate feature of our existence, consciousness resists easy definition. Is it the same as self-awareness, or can you be conscious without being aware that you're aware? Is it synonymous with wakefulness, or can you be conscious while deeply asleep and dreaming? Some researchers define it broadly as any form of subjective experience: the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sense of passing time. Others reserve the term for higher order awareness, the uniquely human ability to think about your own thoughts, to know that you know. Still others speak of different levels or types of consciousness, from the minimal sentience of a simple organism responding to its environment, through the basic awareness of sensory experience, to the rich, reflective consciousness of a human mind capable of pondering its own existence. Some theorists distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the raw feel of experience, and access consciousness, which refers to information that's available for verbal report and rational thought. You might have phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness, as in some forms of blind sight, where patients process visual information without being able to report it consciously. Then there's the question of what consciousness is made of. Is it a thing, a substance, a property? Or is it better understood as a process, a particular pattern of activity that arises under certain conditions? Is consciousness continuous or discrete? Does it fade gradually as you fall asleep, or does it switch off at some threshold? These aren't mere semantic quibbles. This lack of consensus isn't just academic hair-splitting. It reflects how genuinely puzzling consciousness is, even to those who study it full-time. Before you can study something scientifically, you need to define your terms clearly enough. The different researchers are investigating the same phenomenon, but with consciousness, that preliminary step has proven extraordinarily difficult. Fact 3. Consciousness seems to be generated by the brain, but we don't know how. Neuroscientists have made enormous progress mapping which parts of the brain are active during different states of awareness. They can point to specific neural circuits involved in vision, attention, memory, and decision-making. They know that damage to the thalamus disrupts consciousness profoundly. That activity in sensory cortices corresponds to what you're perceiving, that prefrontal regions are involved in self-awareness and metacognition. They can even predict with reasonable accuracy which patterns of brain activity correspond to conscious versus unconscious processing. Using techniques like functional MRI and electroencephalography, researchers have identified neural signatures of consciousness, patterns that reliably distinguish between conscious and unconscious states. They can watch in real time as information enters awareness, observing changes in brain activity as a stimulus crosses the threshold from subliminal to conscious perception. They can map the networks that light up when you're awake and aware, and track how those networks change during sleep, anesthesia, or meditation. Yet, despite all this knowledge, all these correlations between brain states and conscious states, there remains a profound explanatory gap, what philosopher Joseph Levine memorably termed the explanatory gap. We can describe what the brain does in exquisite detail, which neurons fire, which neurotransmitters are released, which circuits activate, but not why those processes should feel like anything at all. Why should patterns of electrical and chemical signals in neurons give rise to the felt quality of experience? Why should there be something it's like to be a brain processing information? This mystery has been called the hard problem of consciousness, and it's the central challenge facing consciousness research today. Fact 4. The hard problem of consciousness was named by philosopher David Chalmers in the early 1990s. Chalmers drew a crucial distinction between what he called the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems include explaining how the brain integrates information from different senses, how it focuses attention on particular stimuli while filtering others, how it controls behavior, how it processes sensory input and transforms it into internal representations. These are called easy, not because they're simple to solve. They're enormously complex problems requiring sophisticated neuroscience, but because we can imagine in principle what a solution would look like. We could explain these cognitive functions through standard neuroscientific methods, describing neural circuits, computational processes, and information flow. The hard problem is fundamentally different. It's the question of why any of this processing should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why doesn't it all happen in the dark, as Chalmers memorably put it, without anyone home to witness it? You could imagine a brain that processes information, discriminates stimuli, stores memories, and controls behavior, all without any inner experience, without it feeling like anything. Such a being would be what philosophers call a zombie. Not the Hollywood kind that eats brains, but a philosophical zombie that's physically and functionally identical to a conscious person, but lacks consciousness entirely. The hard problem asks, why aren't we zombies? Why is there something it is like to be conscious, rather than nothing at all? This problem cuts to the heart of consciousness studies. You can map every neuron, measure every spike, trace every circuit. Yet the question remains, why should these physical processes feel like anything? Why should they generate the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the felt quality of existing? Chalmers argued that no amount of functional explanation, no matter how detailed our understanding of what the brain does, will close this explanatory gap. We need something more, perhaps new physical principles, perhaps a radical reconceptualization of the relationship between mind and matter. The hard problem has defined consciousness research for 3 decades now, with researchers either accepting it as genuine and seeking novel solutions, or rejecting it as based on confused intuitions that will dissolve with better understanding. Fact 5. Consciousness might require something beyond ordinary physics. Some scientists and philosophers argue that explaining consciousness will demand new physical principles, or even a revolution in our understanding of nature. Physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed that quantum processes in structures called microtubules, found inside neurons, might be essential to consciousness. According to their orchestrated objective reduction theory, consciousness arises when quantum states collapse in a particular orchestrated way. While this theory remains controversial and many neuroscientists are skeptical, it highlights how desperate some researchers have become to explain consciousness. If classical physics and standard neuroscience aren't enough, perhaps we need to look to quantum mechanics, or even beyond, Fact 6. Consciousness has a measurable intensity. While the quality of consciousness, what it's like, remains mysterious, its quantity seems more tractable. Integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness can be measured by a value called phi, which represents the amount of integrated information in a system. A system with high phi, like the human brain, has many parts that interact in complex, irreducible ways. A system with low phi, like a collection of disconnected units, generates little or no consciousness. According to this theory, consciousness is not all or nothing, but exists on a continuum. Some systems are more conscious than others, and the degree can, in principle, be calculated. Fact 7. You are conscious of only a tiny fraction of your brain's activity. At any given moment, your brain is processing vast amounts of information, regulating your heartbeat and breathing, maintaining your balance, monitoring your surroundings for threats, retrieving memories, planning movements. Yet only a small portion of this activity enters your awareness. You don't consciously experience the firing of individual neurons, the release of neurotransmitters, or the countless computations that allow you to recognize a face or understand a sentence. Consciousness is like a spotlight, illuminating just a narrow slice of the mind's vast processing power. Everything else happens in the dark, beneath the surface of awareness. Fact 8. The contents of consciousness are constantly changing, yet you experience a unified self. One moment you're aware of the words on a page, the next you're thinking about dinner plans, then noticing a sound outside, then feeling an itch on your arm, then remembering something from yesterday. The stream of consciousness flows continuously, shifting its contents from moment to moment in an endless dance of changing experiences. Yet through all these changes, through all these transitions from one thought, sensation, or perception to another, there's a persistent sense of being the same person, a stable you to whom all these experiences belong. This unity of consciousness is remarkable when you consider what it takes to create it. Your visual experience is constructed from information processed in dozens of specialized brain areas, some analyzing color, others motion, still others shape or depth. Auditory information is processed separately. Touch, smell, taste. Each have their own pathways. Your thoughts recruit networks spanning frontal, parietal, and temporal regions. Memories are stored throughout the brain. Yet all of this activity somehow comes together into a single, coherent, conscious experience. You don't experience vision as separate from hearing, or thought, as disconnected from perception. Everything is bound together into a unified field of awareness. How the brain creates this unity from constantly changing neural activity, distributed across many regions, is one of consciousness's enduring puzzles. Some researchers call it the binding problem, how separate features processed in different brain regions get bound together into a single, coherent art experience. When you see a red apple, neurons analyzing redness fire in one area, neurons responding to round shapes fire in another, neurons processing the apple's location fire in yet another. How do these separate neural responses get unified into your single experience of a red apple here? Various solutions have been proposed. Neural synchrony. Neurons encoding different features of the same object might fire in synchrony, binding them together temporally. Re-entrant processing. Information might flow back and forth between regions until a coherent representation emerges. A central workspace, a hub region that integrates information from disparate areas. But the binding problem remains partially unsolved. a testament to how mysterious the unity of consciousness really is. You experience this unity effortlessly every waking moment, yet understanding how your brain creates it from billions of independent neurons remains a central challenge for neuroscience. The physical foundations. Fact 9. Consciousness requires certain brain structures, but not others. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, but not all of them contribute equally to consciousness. The cerebellum, located at the back of the brain, contains more than half of all these neurons, about 69 billion. Yet damage to it rarely affects consciousness. People with significant cerebellar damage remain awake and aware, though they may have problems with balance and coordination. In contrast, damage to the thalamus or cerebral cortex can profoundly impair consciousness, leading to coma or vegetative states. This tells us that consciousness isn't simply a matter of having lots of neurons. It depends on specific circuits and connectivity patterns. At fact 10, the thalamus acts as a gateway to consciousness. This walnut-sized structure deep in the brain serves as a relay station for sensory information traveling to the cortex. Nearly all sensory input, vision, hearing, touch, passes through the thalamus before reaching conscious awareness. When the thalamus is damaged, patients often lose consciousness entirely or enter a vegetative state. Recent research has identified specific thalamic nuclei that seem especially critical for maintaining wakefulness and awareness. Brain imaging studies show that during different levels of consciousness, from alert wakefulness to deep sleep to anesthesia, activity patterns in the thalamus change dramatically, suggesting it plays a central role in regulating consciousness itself. Fact 11. Consciousness emerges from patterns of neural activity, not individual neurons. No single neuron is conscious. Consciousness appears to arise from the collective behavior of millions or billions of neurons firing in coordinated patterns. Neuroscientists speak of neural assemblies or cell assemblies, groups of neurons that fire together to represent specific aspects of experience. When you see a red apple, for instance, neurons encoding redness, roundness, and appleness all fire in synchrony, creating a unified percept. These assemblies form and dissolve constantly, shifting from one configuration to another as your experience changes. Consciousness, in this view, is less like a thing and more like a process, a constantly evolving pattern dancing across the neural substrate. Fact 12. The brain generates consciousness even when sensory input is absent. During dreams, your eyes are closed and you receive no visual input from the world, yet you experience vivid visual imagery. Hallucinations can produce perceptions in the absence of corresponding stimuli. People in sensory deprivation tanks, cut off from external input, still remain conscious and often experience elaborate inner worlds. These phenomena demonstrate that consciousness doesn't simply mirror the external environment. The brain actively constructs experience, using sensory input when available but capable of generating rich, conscious content even in its absence. In some sense, all conscious experience is a kind of controlled hallucination, a model the brain creates and updates based on incoming information. Fact 13. Consciousness can be temporarily erased and then restored. When you're placed under general anesthesia for surgery, your consciousness doesn't gradually fade, but typically vanishes abruptly. One moment you're awake, counting backward, and the next you're waking up in recovery, with no memory of the intervening time. During that gap, you are unconscious, not merely asleep, but genuinely without experience. Anesthesiologists can precisely control this transition, adjusting drug dosages to keep patients hovering just below the threshold of consciousness. Recent research suggests that anesthetics work by disrupting the integration of information in the brain, preventing different regions from communicating effectively and thus abolishing the unified experience we call consciousness. Fact 14. There's an ascending arousal network that keeps you conscious. Research published in May 2024, using high-resolution brain imaging, mapped a network of interconnected pathways in the brainstem and thalamus that appears to sustain wakefulness. This network, sometimes called the ascending reticular activating system, projects diffusely throughout the cortex, maintaining a baseline level of activity necessary for consciousness. When this system is damaged, patients can fall into coma or persistent vegetative states. Conversely, when it's maximally active, we're alert and focused. Based on this research, scientists suggest the ascending arousal network works like a volume knob for consciousness, regulating its overall intensity, even as the cortex determines its specific contents. Fact 15. Neural synchrony might bind together different aspects of consciousness. When you look at a yellow ball bouncing across the floor, your brain processes its color, shape, motion, and location in separate regions. Color is analyzed in one area of the visual cortex, motion in another, shape in yet another. But you don't experience these features separately. You see a unified object. How does the brain bind these separate pieces of information into a single conscious percept? One prominent theory suggests that neurons encoding different features of the same object fire in synchrony, oscillating together at specific frequencies, particularly in the gamma range of 30 to 100 Hz. This synchronized firing might serve as a temporal code, tagging information that belongs to the same conscious experience. Fact 16. Different brain waves correspond to different states of consciousness. Your brain's electrical activity naturally oscillates at various frequencies, and these oscillations correlate with different conscious states. Beta waves, between 12 and 30 Hz, dominate during active, alert wakefulness. Alpha waves, 8 to 12 Hz, emerge when you're relaxed with eyes closed. Theta waves, 4 to 8 Hz, appear during light sleep and drowsiness. Delta waves, below 4 Hz, characterize deep sleep. Gamma waves, above 30 Hz, are associated with focused attention and might be involved in binding information into conscious experience. By monitoring these brain waves with electroencephalography, neuroscientists can make surprisingly accurate inferences about a person's state of consciousness. Fact 17. Consciousness requires communication between distant brain regions. It's not enough for brain areas to be active, they must also interact. Studies using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation have shown that when consciousness is present, a signal delivered to one part of the cortex propagates throughout the brain in complex patterns. During dreamless sleep or under anesthesia, this same signal produces a much more local, restricted response. Consciousness seems to depend on the brain's ability to integrate information across long distances, creating a unified informational space. When this long-range communication breaks down, consciousness fades, even if local activity remains high. Fact 18. The colostrum might act as a conductor for consciousness. This thin sheet of neurons, tucked deep beneath the cortex, has extensive connections to nearly every part of the cerebral cortex. Some researchers have proposed that the colostrum could function like a conductor of an orchestra, coordinating activity across different cortical regions to create unified, conscious experience. In one striking case reported in the literature, when neuroscientists electrically stimulated the colostrum in a patient during brain surgery, she immediately lost consciousness, becoming unresponsive and unable to remember the event afterward. Once stimulation stopped, consciousness returned. While this suggests a potentially central role, much more research is needed before we can conclude how this structure contributes to awareness. Theories of consciousness. Fact. 19. There are dozens of competing theories of consciousness. Scientists and philosophers have proposed numerous frameworks to explain how consciousness arises from physical processes. These include global workspace theory, which compares consciousness to a spotlight on a stage; higher order thought theory, which argues you're conscious of something only when you have thoughts about it; predictive processing frameworks, which view consciousness as the brain's attempts to predict sensory input; and quantum consciousness theories, which invoke quantum mechanics. Each theory has passionate defenders and critics. None has achieved consensus, and some researchers question whether consciousness can be explained by any theory that stays within conventional physics and neuroscience. Fact 20. Integrated information theory treats consciousness as a fundamental property of certain systems. According to IIT, developed by Giulio Tononi, consciousness isn't something special that emerges from computation or neural activity. Instead, it's an intrinsic property of any system with the right causal structure. Specifically, consciousness requires integrated information that exists as a unified whole and cannot be reduced to independent parts. IIT provides mathematical tools to calculate phi, a measure of integrated information for any system. In principle, you could determine not just whether something is conscious, but precisely how conscious it is. Critics argue the math is intractable for realistic systems, and that some of IIT's implications, such as that a simple grid of logic gates could be conscious, strain credibility. Fact 21. Integrated information theory implies that consciousness could be widespread. If consciousness is integrated information, and integrated information exists whenever a system has the right causal structure, then consciousness might be far more widespread than we typically assume. According to IIT, even simple systems could in principle have minute amounts of consciousness if they integrate information. This position aligns with panpsychism, the view that consciousness, or at least proto-consciousness, might be a fundamental feature of reality, present in many systems. Tononi and his colleagues have acknowledged these implications, suggesting that if the mathematical framework indicates even simple systems could possess some vanishingly small degree of subjective experience under certain conditions, this might reveal something profound about the nature of consciousness itself, though this remains a controversial interpretation of the theory. Fact 22. Global workspace theory compares consciousness to a spotlight on a stage. Proposed by psychologist Bernard Baars and further developed by neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, this theory suggests that the brain contains many specialized, unconscious processes working in parallel, like performers waiting in the wings. Information becomes conscious when it's broadcast to this global workspace, a distributed network that makes the information available to multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. Conscious contents are like whatever happens to be illuminated by the spotlight at any given moment, visible to the entire audience. This theory elegantly explains why consciousness has limited capacity. Only one scene can be spotlit at a time, and why conscious information is available for verbal report, reasoning, and flexible behavior. Fact 23. The quantum consciousness hypothesis suggests awareness involves quantum processes in the brain. Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist and Nobel laureate, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, argue that consciousness can't be explained by classical physics and computational neuroscience alone. Their radical proposal is that quantum coherence in microtubules, protein structures that form part of the cellular skeleton inside neurons, plays a critical role in generating conscious experience. When quantum states in these microtubules reach a threshold, they collapse in what Penrose calls orchestrated objective reduction, giving rise to moments of consciousness. The theory begins with Penrose's argument that human consciousness involves non-computable processes. Drawing on Gödel's incompleteness theorems and other results from mathematical logic, Penrose suggests that human understanding transcends what any algorithm could achieve. If consciousness can't be computed, it must involve some non-computational physical process. Penrose proposes that quantum gravity, the as-yet undiscovered theory unifying quantum mechanics and general relativity, provides this missing ingredient. In particular, he suggests that quantum superpositions spontaneously collapse, not just through environmental interaction, but also through objective features of space-time itself. When the gravitational energy of the superposed states reaches a critical threshold, Hameroff's contribution was identifying a plausible physical substrate for these quantum processes. Microtubules are large enough to shield quantum states from environmental decoherence, at least temporarily. They're also ubiquitous in neurons and involved in numerous cellular functions. Hameroff proposed that the tubulin proteins making up microtubules can exist in superposed quantum states, with orchestrated objective reduction occurring when these superpositions reach Penrose's threshold. Each such collapse would correspond to a moment of consciousness, with the frequency of collapses determining the richness of conscious experience. This theory is highly controversial. Most neuroscientists doubt that quantum effects could survive long enough in the warm, wet environment of the brain to play any functional role. Decoherence, the rapid destruction of quantum superpositions through interaction with the environment, happens incredibly fast at body temperature, typically in femtoseconds, quadrillionths of a second, far too quickly to support the kind of orchestrated processing Penrose and Hameroff envision. Critics also question whether microtubules are really involved in consciousness, noting that other cells contain microtubules without being conscious. Fact 24. Some evidence supports quantum effects in microtubules. Despite widespread skepticism, recent experiments have detected unexpected quantum behaviors in biological systems, giving the quantum consciousness theory a new lease on life. In 2013, Japanese researchers found that microtubules display large-scale quantum resonance at room temperature, giving them unusual long-range electrical conduction properties. These quantum effects persisted far longer than expected, raising the possibility that biological systems might have evolved mechanisms to protect quantum coherence. A 2024 paper reviewed evidence that microtubules are functional targets of anesthetics. Anesthetics, which reliably eliminate consciousness at precise dosages, bind to hydrophobic pockets in microtubules. If disrupting microtubular quantum states is how anesthetics work, this would provide strong support for the theory that these quantum states are involved in consciousness. The paper also cited direct physical evidence of macroscopic quantum entanglement in the human brain, correlated with conscious states and working memory performance. While these findings don't prove Penrose and Hameroff's full theory, they don't demonstrate orchestrated objective reduction or non-computability. They do suggest that quantum effects in the brain might be more important than previously believed. Other research has shown that quantum coherence can occur in photosynthesis, navigation in birds, and other biological processes. If evolution has found ways to harness quantum mechanics for biological functions, perhaps the brain has done so too. The idea that consciousness might require quantum processes remains speculative, but it's no longer as easily dismissed as it once was. As one researcher put it, the question is no longer whether quantum effects occur in the brain. They clearly do, but whether they're relevant to consciousness specifically. Fact 25. Higher order theories claim you're only conscious of what you're conscious of being conscious of. These theories, developed by philosophers like David Rosenthal and others, propose that consciousness requires a higher level of representation. You need not just to perceive something, but to perceive that you're perceiving it. A first-order representation of, say, a red apple isn't sufficient for consciousness. You need a second-order representation, a thought about your perception of the apple, a meta-awareness of the perceptual state itself. The appeal of this view is that it explains why some mental states seem conscious while others don't. You have countless unconscious representations. Your brain constantly processes information about balance, digestion, pupil dilation, and myriad other functions. These are genuine representations, carrying information and influencing behavior, but they're not conscious. What makes the difference, according to higher order theories, is whether you have a higher order representation of them. When you do, they become conscious. When you don't, they remain unconscious. But this view faces challenges. Critics argue it leads to an infinite regress. If consciousness requires being aware of being aware, don't you need to be aware of being aware of being aware, and so on forever? Defenders respond that the regress stops at the second level. Consciousness requires second-order awareness, but not third-order, fourth-order, and so on. Once you have a thought about your perception, that's sufficient for the perception to be conscious. You don't need additional thoughts about having thoughts about perceptions. Another worry is that higher order theories seem to get the explanatory order wrong. Intuitively, we become aware of our mental states, not the reverse. But higher order theories say a mental state becomes conscious by having another state directed at it. This seems to put the cart before the horse. Nevertheless, higher order theories remain influential, particularly among philosophers trying to explain consciousness in naturalistic terms, compatible with standard neuroscience. Fact 26. Predictive processing theories view consciousness as the brain's model of reality. According to this framework, the brain is constantly generating predictions about what sensory input it expects to receive. What reaches consciousness isn't raw sensory data, but the brain's best guess about what's causing those sensations, updated when predictions fail. Consciousness, in this view, is the brain's continuously updated model of itself and the world. This explains many phenomena, such as why we don't notice our own blind spots. The brain fills them in with predictions. Or why expectations shape perception. Predictions influence what we consciously experience. Consciousness becomes less about passively receiving information and more about actively constructing a world. Fact 27. Some theories deny that consciousness is a real phenomenon. Eliminative materialists, including philosopher Daniel Dennett, argue that our intuitive understanding of consciousness is fundamentally mistaken. They suggest that what we call consciousness is a kind of cognitive illusion, a story the brain tells itself that doesn't correspond to any actual process. According to Dennett, there are no ineffable qualia, no inner theatre where experiences appear. There are only various brain processes and the mistaken belief that there's a unified, subjective I experiencing them. This view is deeply counterintuitive. How can the most certain thing we know, our own experience, be an illusion? But Dennett argues that our intuitions mislead us. Fact 28. The electromagnetic field theory proposes consciousness resides in the brain's electromagnetic field. Neuroscientist John Joe McFadden suggests that consciousness isn't produced by neurons directly, but by the electromagnetic field they generate. This field integrates information from millions of neurons simultaneously, creating a unified conscious experience. The theory explains why consciousness seems holistic rather than piecemeal. The EM field naturally binds information together. It also makes testable predictions about how consciousness should be affected by electromagnetic interference. While intriguing, the theory remains controversial, and many neuroscientists are skeptical that the brain's EM field is strong or structured enough to play this role. Fact 29. Consciousness might arise from self-referential loops. Mathematician and philosopher Douglas Hofstadter proposed that consciousness emerges from strange loops, self-referential patterns where a system reaches back and affects itself, creating tangled hierarchies without a clear top or bottom. Your brain represents the world, including your own brain, and represents its representations, creating endless loops of self-reference. Consciousness, Hofstadter argues, is what it feels like to be such a loop, a self-sustaining pattern that has somehow become aware of itself. This theory is more metaphorical than mathematical, but it captures something important about the recursive, self-referential nature of conscious experience. Fact 30. No theory has definitively solved the hard problem. Despite decades of research and dozens of proposals, no theory has achieved widespread acceptance as the explanation for consciousness. Each framework captures some aspects of conscious experience, while leaving others unexplained. Some theories are criticized for not really addressing consciousness at all, for explaining cognitive functions, while ignoring why those functions feel like anything. Others are too speculative, invoking exotic physics without sufficient evidence. Still others are mathematically elegant, but empirically untestable. The hard problem remains hard, and consciousness continues to resist our best explanatory efforts. Some scientists believe we're making progress. Others suspect we're missing something fundamental. Animal consciousness. Fact 31. We now have strong evidence that many animals are conscious. In 2012, a group of prominent neuroscientists gathered at the University of Cambridge and signed what became known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. This document affirmed that non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures including octopuses, possess the neurological substrates necessary for consciousness. This marked a significant shift in scientific consensus. Rather than treating animal consciousness as speculative or anthropomorphic, researchers now broadly accept that subjective experience is likely widespread in the animal kingdom. The question has shifted from which animals are conscious to what forms does their consciousness take. Fact 32. A declaration in 2024 expanded the circle of potential consciousness even further. In April 2024, nearly 40 researchers signed the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness at a conference at New York University. This document stated there's strong scientific support for consciousness in mammals and birds, and a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, and fish. It even extended this possibility to some invertebrates, including insects, crabs, lobsters, and cephalopods, like octopuses and cuttlefish. The declaration emphasized that when there's a realistic possibility of consciousness, we have obligations to consider the welfare of these animals. This represents a dramatic expansion, of which creatures scientists believe we should take seriously as potential subjects of experience. Fact 33. Octopuses might have a form of consciousness very different from ours. These remarkable creatures have about 500 million neurons, with roughly 2/3 distributed in their 8 arms rather than centralized in their brain. Each arm can act semi-independently, solving problems without constant input from the central nervous system. Recent research suggests octopuses may have subjective experiences. Studies show they avoid locations where they've experienced pain and prefer places where they've received pain relief, which could indicate they remember and respond to discomfort in ways that suggest consciousness. They can also remember details of specific past events. But if octopuses are conscious, their experience might be fundamentally alien, perhaps more distributed than centralized, with each arm potentially having its own form of processing. What it's like to be an octopus, if there's something it's like at all, might be nearly impossible for us to imagine. Fact 34. Crows and ravens display behavior suggesting complex consciousness. Corvids, the family including crows, ravens, and jays, have been called feathered apes for their remarkable cognitive abilities. They can plan for the future, use tools, recognize individual humans, and may even engage in something resembling mental time travel, imagining past and future events. Recent studies suggest they might have access to incidentally encoded information within their memories, which could represent a form of conscious recollection, though this remains an active area of investigation. While the structure of bird brains differs significantly from mammalian brains, corvids appear to have independently evolved sophisticated forms of intelligence. A 2025 paper used a 5-dimensional framework to explore what consciousness might be like for corvids, though we should remember these are informed speculations based on behavior and neuroscience rather than direct access to their subjective experience. Fact 35. Fish can recognize themselves in mirrors, suggesting self-awareness. Studies conducted between 2019 and 2023 showed that cleaner rasa fish can pass versions of the mirror test, long considered a marker of self-recognition. When a mark is placed on their body in a location they can only see in a mirror, they scrape their body against surfaces as if trying to remove it, behavior that suggests some degree of self-awareness, at least in terms of body representation. Previously, only a handful of species, great apes, elephants, dolphins, and magpies, had passed this test. The discovery that a fish species can demonstrate this behavior challenges long-held assumptions about which animals possess higher-order consciousness, though researchers continue to debate exactly what passing the mirror test tells us about subjective experience. Fact 36. Garter snakes recognize their own scent, a form of self-awareness. Research has shown that snakes can distinguish their own scent from that of other snakes, indicating a basic sense of self. While this might seem simple compared to mirror recognition, it demonstrates that even reptiles, with their relatively small brains, maintain some concept of self versus other. This matters because consciousness likely exists on a spectrum. Even if a snake's subjective experience is dim compared to a human's, it might still possess some rudimentary form of awareness, some minimal what it's like to be a snake. Fact 37. Bees might have basic forms of consciousness. Insects were long considered mere biological robots, responding to stimuli without any inner experience. But research increasingly challenges this view. Bees can learn from experience, make decisions based on expected outcomes, and even display what researchers interpret as something like emotions. They appear to become more pessimistic in their decision-making after experiencing stressful events, while their consciousness, if it exists at all, would likely be vastly simpler than ours. The possibility that even an insect might have some glimmer of subjective experience forces us to reconsider consciousness's boundaries. Some researchers now seriously investigate whether bees and even flies might possess sentience. though this remains a frontier of research where evidence is still accumulating and interpretations vary. Factor 38. Animal consciousness varies along multiple dimensions. Rather than asking the binary question of whether animals are conscious or not, researchers now recognize this is far too simplistic. Consciousness isn't one thing that you either have or don't have, but a multidimensional space with many possible profiles. Researchers now map consciousness along several key dimensions to create richer, more accurate pictures of what conscious experience might be like for different species. Perceptual richness refers to how detailed and fine-grained sensory experiences are in different modalities. A crow might have extraordinarily rich visual consciousness, perceiving colors and spatial relationships in great detail, but relatively impoverished olfactory consciousness compared to a dog. An octopus might have rich tactile consciousness through its arms, but lack the auditory richness humans possess. Bats perceive the world through echolocation in ways we can barely imagine. Their perceptual richness in the acoustic domain might vastly exceed ours, while their visual consciousness is minimal. Evaluative richness concerns the range and complexity of emotions, desires, and value experiences. Do animals feel simple valences of pleasure and pain, or more complex emotions like jealousy, guilt, pride, or anticipation? Evidence suggests many mammals experience rich emotional lives. Elephants grieving their dead, dogs showing what appears to be shame, primates displaying empathy and fairness concerns. But how far does this evaluative richness extend? Do fish feel complex emotions, or just basic attractions and aversions? What about insects? The question remains open, but is crucial for ethics and welfare considerations. Integration or unity addresses whether an animal's consciousness is unified like ours or more fragmented. Given that octopuses have distributed nervous systems with much of their neurons in their arms, is their consciousness unified, or does each arm have its own mini-consciousness? For most mammals with centralized brains, consciousness likely has high unity, but for radically different neural architectures, the question becomes fascinating and difficult. Temporal depth, or temporal extension, concerns the time span consciousness encompasses, the capacity for mental time travel, remembering the past and imagining the future. Humans can vividly recall specific events from years ago and plan for distant futures. Some animals show evidence of episodic memory and future planning. Scrub jays cache food for later. Rats replay past experiences to improve future decisions. But many animals likely live more in the present moment, with consciousness extending only seconds or minutes into past and future rather than years. Self-awareness is another dimension, ranging from no sense of self at all, through bodily self-awareness, knowing your body's location and state, to psychological self-awareness, recognizing yourself as having beliefs, desires, and a perspective. The mirror test attempts to measure bodily self-awareness. Species that pass, recognizing themselves in mirrors, include great apes, elephants, dolphins, and surprisingly, some birds and fish. But psychological self-awareness, theory of mind, understanding others as having minds like your own, this seems rarer, perhaps limited to great apes and possibly some corvids and cetaceans. Fact 39. Some animals might be conscious in ways we can never fully understand. Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously asked in his 1974 paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" He argued that even with complete knowledge of bat neuroscience, even if we could describe every neural mechanism involved in echolocation, we couldn't truly know the subjective quality of their experience. What is it like to navigate by sound, to build a spatial model of the world from echoes. We can describe the function and maybe simulate it computationally, but we can't know the felt quality, the what, its likeness of experiencing the world through echolocation. This limitation applies to many animals. What is it like to experience the world through a dog's sense of smell, which is 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than ours? Dogs don't just smell stronger odors, they detect chemical concentrations we can't even imagine, distinguishing left and right nostril scents to locate odor sources, smelling time as molecules disperse and degrade. Their olfactory cortex is proportionally much larger than ours. If smell dominates their conscious experience the way vision dominates ours, we can barely conceive what their inner world is like. Birds perceive magnetic fields for navigation. Some can see ultraviolet light. Mantis shrimp have 16 types of color receptors compared to our 3, potentially seeing colors we can't imagine. Electric fish sense electric fields to navigate and communicate. Snakes detect infrared radiation from warm bodies. Each of these sensory modalities creates a form of conscious experience that might be fundamentally inaccessible to us. Not because we lack information, but because subjective experience is inherently first person, bound to the particular sensory apparatus generating it. Some aspects of other species' consciousness might thus remain forever alien to us. We can study their behavior, map their brains, even create artificial systems that process information similarly, but we may never know what it's actually like to be them. This places limits on consciousness science. We can study structure and function, but the subjective quality might always elude complete understanding when it's too different from our own. Fact 40. The discovery of widespread animal consciousness has profound ethical implications. Every new finding about animal consciousness transforms not just our scientific understanding, but our moral responsibilities. If fish can suffer, really suffer, with genuine subjective distress, should we reconsider industrial fishing practices that kill trillions of fish annually? If insects might be sentient, with however dim a consciousness, should the billions killed by pesticides or in research laboratories be considered? If crabs and lobsters have subjective experiences, is it ethical to boil them alive, as is common practice in many restaurants? These aren't just philosophical questions, but practical ones affecting billions of animals and major industries. The United Kingdom passed legislation in 2021 officially recognizing octopuses, crabs, and lobsters as sentient beings, extending animal welfare protections to them. This means they can't legally be boiled alive without prior stunning. The EU has similar protections. As our scientific understanding expands, legal and ethical frameworks are struggling to keep pace. If consciousness is more widespread than we thought, how far does our circle of moral concern extend? What do we owe to beings that can suffer, but can't speak for themselves, that have inner lives, but can't communicate them to us? The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness emphasizes that when there's a realistic possibility of consciousness in an animal, we have obligations to consider its welfare seriously. Realistic possibility, not proof, should be sufficient to prompt ethical concern. After all, we can never prove other humans are conscious either. We infer it from similarity in behavior. If we extend that inference to animals showing similar behavioral markers, we may need to radically rethink how we treat them in farms, fisheries, laboratories, zoos, and the wild. This extends to future scenarios too. If humans colonize other planets, we might bring along insects and other invertebrates as food sources or parts of ecological systems. If these creatures can suffer, we'd be obligating ourselves to consider their welfare even on Mars or beyond. As we develop artificial intelligence, similar questions arise. If AI systems ever become conscious, would anti-speciesist principles apply to them too? Would consciousness, not biological species or physical substrate, become the criterion for moral consideration? Fact 41. Some animals experience time differently, affecting their consciousness. A fly perceives time in slow motion compared to humans. To a fly, your hand moving to swat it seems to approach slowly, giving the insect time to escape. This is because a fly's nervous system processes visual information much faster than ours. Their flicker fusion rate is about 10 times higher. This means a fly's subjective experience of time passing might be fundamentally different from yours. Similarly, large animals with slower metabolisms might experience time more quickly than small, fast metabolizing creatures. If consciousness involves temporal experience, these differences suggest radically diverse ways of being conscious. Fact 42. We're now investigating whether consciousness exists in organisms without brains. Plants respond to their environment in complex ways, growing toward light, communicating through chemical signals, even making something resembling decisions about resource allocation. Some researchers ask whether these behaviors might be accompanied by some minimal form of experience. Similarly, slime molds can solve mazes and optimize networks despite lacking nervous systems. While most scientists remain skeptical that plants or fungi are conscious in any meaningful sense, these cases push us to articulate exactly what consciousness requires. Must you have neurons, a centralized nervous system, the ability to integrate information, or could consciousness be even more widespread than currently imagined? The neural correlates. Fact 43. Certain brain regions are more important for consciousness than others. The neural correlates of consciousness are the minimal set of brain mechanisms sufficient for a specific conscious experience. Researchers have identified a network involving the thalamus, cortex, and brainstem as particularly critical. The posterior cortex, especially parietal and occipital areas, seems more important than frontal areas. This is somewhat surprising, since the frontal cortex is associated with higher cognitive functions. But it appears that prefrontal regions are more important for accessing and reporting consciousness than for generating it. When the posterior cortex is damaged, conscious experience itself diminishes, while frontal damage affects what patients can do with their conscious contents. Fact 44. The default mode network might be involved in self-referential consciousness. This network of brain regions becomes active when you're not focused on the external world, when you're daydreaming, thinking about yourself, or mind-wandering. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, and medial temporal lobes. Recent research suggests this network is crucial for self-awareness and the sense of having a continuous identity over time. When the default mode network is disrupted, as happens with psychedelics, people report a dissolution of the sense of self, suggesting this network helps construct the subjective feeling of being a unified person, persisting through time. Fact 45. Brain connectivity patterns change dramatically during loss of consciousness. When you fall into deep sleep or are placed under anesthesia, overall brain activity doesn't necessarily decrease much. What changes is how different regions communicate. During consciousness, information flows dynamically across the brain, with signals from one area affecting many others. During unconsciousness, this long-range connectivity breaks down. Brain regions become more isolated, responding locally to stimulation, but failing to coordinate globally. Using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation combined with EEG, researchers can measure this breakdown, providing an objective marker of consciousness level that doesn't rely on behavioral responses. Factor 46. The cortex might not be strictly necessary for some forms of consciousness. Children born without a cortex, a rare condition called hydranencephaly, nonetheless display behaviors suggesting some level of awareness. They respond to sounds, show preferences, and interact with caregivers. Adults with extensive cortical damage can still exhibit signs of minimal consciousness. This suggests that subcortical structures like the thalamus and brainstem might support rudimentary forms of conscious experience, even when the cortex is severely compromised. Such cases challenge theories that place the cortex at the center of consciousness, suggesting a more distributed model, where conscious states can be sustained by various neural configurations. Fact 47. Different sensory modalities have different neural correlates. The neural activity that makes you consciously aware of a sound differs from that which makes you aware of a visual image or a touch. Visual consciousness involves the occipital cortex and lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Auditory consciousness recruits the temporal cortex and medial geniculate nucleus. Touch involves the parietal cortex and ventral posterior nucleus. This suggests that consciousness isn't a single global state, but a coalition of modality-specific processes. Your unified experience of seeing and hearing simultaneously might emerge from the coordination of these separate streams, rather than from a single conscious mechanism. Fact 48. Brain oscillations might carry conscious content. Different frequencies of neural oscillation are associated with different cognitive functions. Theta oscillations, 4 to 8 Hz, are important for memory encoding and retrieval. Alpha oscillations, 8 to 12 Hz, might inhibit irrelevant information, filtering what enters consciousness. Beta oscillations, 12 to 30 Hz, are associated with active thinking and attention. Gamma oscillations, above 30 Hz, might bind together different features of conscious percepts. These oscillations aren't just byproducts of neural activity, but might actively shape what becomes conscious. By entraining brain rhythms using external stimulation, researchers can influence conscious perception, suggesting oscillations play a functional role. Fact 49. The brain's anatomical connectivity constrains possible conscious states. Not every pattern of neural activity is possible. Your brain's wiring limits which neurons can influence which others. These constraints shape what you can consciously experience. For instance, the hierarchical organization of visual cortex, with simple features processed first and complex ones later, means you can't consciously perceive high-level patterns without first processing low-level features. The brain's anatomical structure thus acts as a physical scaffold for consciousness, determining both what experiences are possible and how they're organized. Understanding this structure is crucial for understanding consciousness itself. Fact 50. Damage to specific brain regions can eliminate specific conscious experiences. Visual cortex damage can make you blind, not just unable to respond to visual input, but genuinely without visual experience. Damage to auditory cortex can eliminate conscious hearing. Certain lesions cause anosognosia, where patients are unaware of their deficits. They might be paralyzed, but genuinely not realize it, suggesting consciousness of their body state has been lost. These dissociations show that consciousness isn't unitary, but composed of many parts, each dependent on specific neural substrates. Consciousness can fracture, with some experiences preserved and others eliminated. Fact 51. The concept of neural complexity helps predict consciousness. Neuroscientist Anil Seth and colleagues have developed measures of neural complexity based on signal diversity and integration. When the brain is conscious, its activity is neither too ordered, like during a seizure, nor too disordered, like random noise, but occupies a Goldilocks zone of intermediate complexity. During deep sleep or anesthesia, complexity decreases. This complexity measure can distinguish conscious from unconscious states even when overall activity levels are similar, making it a potentially useful clinical tool for assessing patients with disorders of consciousness. Fact 52. Brain imaging can sometimes decode conscious content. Using functional MRI, researchers can predict what someone is seeing, hearing, or even dreaming about. Machine learning algorithms trained on brain activity patterns can distinguish between different visual categories or reconstruct rough images of what someone is viewing. While far from mind reading, these techniques demonstrate that conscious content has reliable neural signatures. Specific patterns of activity correspond to specific experiences, and by measuring those patterns, we can make educated guesses about what someone is conscious of, even if they can't report it themselves. Fact 53. The brain's metabolic activity provides clues about consciousness. Consciousness is energetically expensive. The human brain, just 2% of body weight, consumes about 20% of the body's energy. But this consumption isn't uniform across brain states. During deep sleep or anesthesia, metabolic activity drops, particularly in regions associated with consciousness. PET scans measuring glucose metabolism can distinguish conscious from unconscious states and correlate with consciousness level in patients with brain injuries. Areas of high metabolic activity often overlap with neural correlates of consciousness, suggesting that maintaining conscious states requires substantial energy. Fact 54. Neuroplasticity allows consciousness to adapt after brain damage. The brain isn't a static machine, but constantly rewires itself. After injury, other regions can sometimes compensate for lost functions, and consciousness can partially recover. Patients in minimally conscious states sometimes improve as their brains reorganize. This plasticity suggests consciousness doesn't require one specific neural configuration, but can be sustained by various patterns as long as certain functional properties are preserved. Understanding this plasticity might help develop therapies to promote recovery of consciousness after brain injury, altered states, and phenomena. Fact 55. During deep sleep, consciousness dims but doesn't completely vanish. For years, scientists believed dreamless sleep was unconscious. But when people are awakened from deep sleep and asked immediately about their experience, many report some form of consciousness, vague thoughts, feelings, or a sense of existing. These experiences are dim and often quickly forgotten, which is why we usually remember deep sleep as unconscious. But emerging evidence suggests consciousness continues through much of sleep, just in a reduced, minimally contentful form. Only in the deepest stages might consciousness truly disappear, though even this remains debated. Fact 56. Dreams are a special state of consciousness with its own logic. When you dream, you're conscious, vividly so, but your consciousness operates differently than during waking. You accept impossible scenarios without question, frequently experience intense emotions, often cannot recognize that you're dreaming, and typically lose access to memories of your waking life. Brain imaging shows that during REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, the limbic system involved in emotions is highly active, while the prefrontal cortex, involved in rational thinking and self-awareness, shows reduced activity. This neurological pattern explains why dreams feel so emotional, yet so illogical. Fact 57. Lucid dreaming allows consciousness to become aware it's dreaming. Some people can recognize they're dreaming while the dream continues, entering a state called lucid dreaming. Once lucid, they can sometimes control dream events, flying, or transforming objects at will. Lab studies have verified lucid dreaming by having dreamers perform predetermined eye movements upon becoming lucid, a signal that can be detected by electrooculography. Lucid dreaming demonstrates that consciousness is flexible, capable of meta-awareness even in altered states. It also provides a unique laboratory for studying consciousness, since lucid dreamers can report on their experiences in real time using pre-arranged signals. Fact 58. General anesthesia works by disrupting integration in the brain. Anesthetics don't simply suppress overall brain activity. Instead, they seem to prevent different brain regions from communicating effectively. Under anesthesia, you might still have local processing. Individual brain areas respond to stimuli, but this information isn't integrated into a unified conscious experience. The anterior and posterior regions of the cortex become functionally disconnected. This aligns with theories suggesting consciousness requires integration. When information processing becomes fragmented, consciousness disappears, even if the fragments remain active. Fact 59. Different anesthetics might eliminate consciousness through different mechanisms. There are many types of anesthetic drugs, gases like sevoflurane, intravenous agents like propofol, and dissociatives like ketamine. Remarkably, despite having different molecular structures and binding to different brain receptors, they all eliminate consciousness. Recent research suggests some anesthetics might work by disrupting quantum coherence in microtubules inside neurons, as Penrose and Hameroff predicted. Others might act on various receptors or ion channels. The fact that many different mechanisms can all eliminate consciousness suggests consciousness might depend on several parallel processes, any one of which is sufficient to disrupt it. Fact 60. Psychedelic drugs profoundly alter consciousness without eliminating it. Substances like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT don't make you unconscious, but radically transform conscious experience. Users report synesthesia, seeing sounds, hearing colors, ego dissolution, loss of the sense of self, mystical experiences, and encounters with entities. Brain imaging shows these drugs increase entropy and connectivity in brain networks, making previously disconnected regions communicate. They particularly affect the default mode network, which might explain ego dissolution. Interestingly, despite increasing brain connectivity and complexity, psychedelics are sometimes described as showing users consciousness in a more raw form, suggesting our normal consciousness filters and simplifies experience. Fact 61. Psychedelics might temporarily reorganize brain networks. Studies conducted in 2025 have shown that psychedelic compounds can rapidly reorganize brain networks, potentially dissolving rigid patterns of thought associated with depression, trauma, and addiction. The drugs appear to increase neuroplasticity, allowing the brain to form new connections and patterns. Users often describe feeling their habitual patterns of thought breaking down, followed by new perspectives emerging. This could help explain why psychedelics show promise in treating psychiatric conditions. They may allow consciousness to reorganize itself, escaping ruts that perpetuate mental illness. The therapeutic potential of these altered states has become a major research focus, with ongoing clinical trials investigating their efficacy for various conditions. Fact 62. Meditation can alter consciousness without drugs. Experienced meditators report profound shifts in conscious experience, a sense of boundlessness, loss of subject-object distinction, pure awareness without content, or perception of reality as fundamentally empty. Brain imaging shows meditation affects the same networks altered by psychedelics, including the default mode network. Long-term meditators show structural changes in brain regions associated with attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. These findings suggest consciousness is more flexible than we typically realize, capable of radically different modes that can be accessed through training alone. Fact 63. Hypnosis creates a distinct state of consciousness. Under hypnosis, people become highly responsive to suggestions, sometimes experiencing hallucinations, analgesia, or amnesia. Brain imaging reveals that hypnosis isn't sleep or mere imagination, but a unique state with characteristic neural signatures, activity patterns in regions involved in executive control, attention, and self-monitoring change distinctly during hypnosis. Highly hypnotizable individuals show different baseline brain connectivity than those who are difficult to hypnotize, suggesting consciousness's susceptibility to suggestion varies across individuals based on neural architecture. Factor 64. Near-death experiences raise puzzling questions about consciousness. People who've been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no breathing, sometimes report vivid conscious experiences during that time. They describe leaving their bodies, moving through tunnels, encountering deceased relatives, or experiencing overwhelming peace. Skeptics argue these experiences likely occur just before or after the period of unconsciousness, not during it, as memory formation is notoriously unreliable around traumatic events. However, some cases are harder to explain away, with reports of accurate perceptions that the patients claim occurred while they were objectively unconscious. Whether these represent genuine consciousness during brain shutdown, are reconstructed memories, or reflect brief moments of brain activity during resuscitation, remains one of neuroscience's most debated mysteries. The question of what, if anything, these experiences tell us about consciousness continues to generate both scientific investigation and philosophical speculation. Fact 65. Consciousness persists in paradoxical ways during vegetative states. Some patients in vegetative states, awake but showing no signs of awareness, turn out to have hidden consciousness. When asked to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house while in an fMRI scanner, their brains show activity patterns identical to healthy people performing the same mental imagery. They're conscious and can understand and respond to instructions, but cannot produce behavioral evidence of awareness. This discovery has revolutionized how we assess consciousness in unresponsive patients and raised ethical concerns about how such patients are treated. Fact 66. Sensory deprivation can induce altered states of consciousness. In flotation tanks or isolation chambers, deprived of external input, many people experience hallucinations, mystical states, or profound relaxation. Without sensory input to constrain it, consciousness turns inward, sometimes generating vivid imagery or unusual thoughts. Some researchers compare this to dreaming while awake. The experience demonstrates that consciousness doesn't require continuous environmental stimulation. Your brain generates conscious content, even in the absence of input, suggesting that consciousness is more about internal models and predictions than passive reception of information, the boundaries of consciousness. Fact 67. Consciousness exists on a spectrum, not as a binary state. You're not simply conscious or unconscious. Consciousness has degrees, from deep coma, minimal to no consciousness, through vegetative state, minimally conscious state, locked-in syndrome, emergence from coma, and the full waking consciousness of a healthy adult. Even within normal waking life, consciousness fluctuates. You're more conscious when alert and focused than when drowsy or distracted. The realization that consciousness is graded rather than all or nothing has major implications for medicine, ethics, and our understanding of consciousness itself. Fact 68. Split brain patients reveal consciousness can be divided. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres is severed, a rare surgical treatment for severe epilepsy, the two hemispheres can no longer communicate directly. Experiments show these patients sometimes appear to have two separate streams of processing and response. The left hemisphere might be aware of something and the right hemisphere is not, and vice versa. Each hemisphere can independently process information and direct behavior. This raises a profound philosophical question that researchers continue to debate. Does a split brain patient have one consciousness or two? One interpretation that some philosophers find compelling, though unsettling, is that severing the corpus callosum could literally create two separate conscious beings where before there was one, though this remains deeply controversial. Fact 69. Some split brain patients seem to have two different opinions simultaneously. In one famous case, when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, a split brain patient's right hemisphere spelled out automobile racer, using Scrabble tiles with his left hand controlled by the right hemisphere, while his left hemisphere verbally answered draftsman. The left hemisphere controls speech. He wasn't being indecisive. Each hemisphere genuinely wanted different things. Cases like this suggest each hemisphere might have its own desires, beliefs, and conscious experiences, though how to interpret this philosophically remains deeply controversial. Fact 70. Blind sight shows you can process information without consciousness. Some people with damage to visual cortex are clinically blind in part of their visual field. They report seeing nothing there. But when forced to guess about objects in that blind region, they perform better than chance. They can navigate around obstacles they claim not to see, or identify emotions on faces they swear are invisible. This is blind sight, visual processing without visual consciousness. It demonstrates that consciousness and information processing can come apart. Your brain can use information in sophisticated ways without that information ever entering awareness. Fact 71. Disorders of consciousness force us to confront consciousness's fragility. Coma, vegetative state, minimally conscious state, locked-in syndrome. These conditions exist on the knife edge between consciousness and unconsciousness. Patients might be awake but not aware, or aware but unable to communicate. They challenge our intuitions and our measurement tools. How do you determine if someone is conscious when they can't tell you? Can consciousness exist without any external signs? These aren't just clinical questions, but philosophical ones, forcing us to articulate precisely what consciousness is and how we recognize it. Fact 72. The locked-in syndrome shows consciousness can exist without movement. These patients are conscious and aware, but completely paralyzed, except for vertical eye movements. They can hear, see, think, and feel, but cannot speak, gesture, or move. Jean-Dominique Bauby, an editor who developed locked-in syndrome, dictated an entire book by blinking his left eyelid. His account confirms that consciousness persists fully, even when the body becomes almost entirely unresponsive. Locked-in syndrome reminds us that consciousness and behavior, though usually linked, are separable. Someone might be richly conscious, but have no way to show it. Fact 73. Consciousness can be lost temporarily during absence seizures. During these brief seizures, lasting just seconds, people lose consciousness completely while remaining upright and with eyes open. They might stop mid-sentence, stare blankly, then resume talking as if nothing happened, with no memory of the gap. Absence seizures demonstrate how suddenly consciousness can switch off and on. They also show that consciousness requires more than just being awake. The brain can be active and producing complex patterns without generating conscious experience if the patterns have the wrong structure. Fact 74. Hemispatial neglect shows consciousness can ignore half of existence. After certain right hemisphere strokes, patients develop neglect syndrome. They're unaware of the left side of space. They eat only food on the right side of their plate, shave only the right side of their face, and when asked to draw a clock, cram all 12 numbers onto the right half. Most strikingly, they're not aware anything is missing. Their conscious experience simply doesn't include that entire half of space. This shows consciousness actively constructs the world we experience, and that construction can be incomplete, even dramatically so, without the subject realizing it. Fact 75. Anosognosia is unconsciousness of unconsciousness. Some patients with severe deficits, paralysis, blindness, aphasia, are completely unaware of their impairments. A paralyzed patient might insist they can move their arm, becoming frustrated when asked to demonstrate. A blind patient might confabulate, describing things that aren't there, rather than admit to blindness. This unawareness seems itself to be unconscious. Patients are not conscious of being unconscious of their deficit. Anosognosia shows that consciousness involves self-monitoring, and when that monitoring fails, whole swaths of reality can disappear from awareness without the subject noticing anything wrong. Fact 76. Consciousness involves both content and level. Content is what you're conscious of: the blue of the sky, the sound of rain, the thought of dinner. Level is how conscious you are: alert, drowsy, delirious, comatose. These dimensions can vary independently. You might be highly conscious, high level, with little content, sensory deprivation, or have complex content in a dream, while at a reduced level of consciousness compared to waking. Understanding that consciousness has multiple dimensions helps explain various disorders and altered states where level and content dissociate in different ways. Fact 77. Some brain activities that seem conscious aren't, and vice versa. Brain regions can be highly active without supporting consciousness. The cerebellum is enormously active, but seems to contribute little to conscious experience. Conversely, some types of consciousness might involve relatively low neural activity if the activity is highly integrated and organized. This means you can't identify consciousness simply by measuring how active the brain is. You need to know not just how much activity there is, but what kind. Its organization, integration, and pattern matter more than mere quantity. Fact 78. The threshold for consciousness might be sharp or gradual. Does consciousness gradually fade as neural activity decreases, or does it suddenly blink out at some critical threshold? This remains unresolved. Some evidence suggests phase transitions, where small changes in brain connectivity can suddenly flip the system from conscious to unconscious. Other findings suggest more gradual changes. The answer might differ for different types of consciousness or depend on what exactly is being measured. Whether consciousness has a sharp boundary or fuzzy edge has implications for how we think about and measure it. Philosophical questions. Fact 79. qualia are the subjective qualities of conscious experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the tartness of lemon. These felt qualities are called qualia. They're what it's subjectively like to have certain experiences. Philosophers debate whether qualia are real features of consciousness or cognitive illusions, whether they can be explained in physical terms, and whether they play any functional role or are merely epiphenomenal, phenomena that exist but don't cause anything. The problem of qualia is central to consciousness studies because it highlights the explanatory gap. Even if we fully understand the brain mechanisms involved in seeing red, will we understand why seeing red feels the way it does? Fact 80. The zombie thought experiment challenges physical explanations of consciousness. Imagine a being physically identical to you, with the same brain structure and neural activity, but with no conscious experience. A philosophical zombie. It acts like you, talks like you, even claims to be conscious, but inside it's dark. There's nothing it's like to be it. If such zombies are conceivable, philosopher David Chalmers argues, consciousness can't be purely physical. Physical facts don't determine facts about consciousness. Critics respond that zombies might be conceivable but not truly possible, or that the intuition that they're conceivable is mistaken. The debate continues. Fact 81. Mary's room challenges whether physical knowledge is complete. Philosopher Frank Jackson imagined Mary, a scientist who knows everything physical about color, but has lived in a black and white room her entire life. When she finally sees color for the first time, does she learn something new? If yes, there's knowledge that can't be captured by physical descriptions, experiential knowledge, what it's like to see red. This suggests consciousness involves non-physical facts. If no, our intuitions about experience are misleading. Like the zombie argument, Mary's room highlights the gap between objective, physical descriptions and subjective, conscious experience. Fact 82. Panpsychism suggests consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. If consciousness can't be explained by physical processes, maybe it's not something that emerges from complexity, but exists at the most basic level. Panpsychism proposes that all matter has at least rudimentary consciousness. Electrons might have infinitesimally small degrees of experience. Larger systems, like brains, have vastly more consciousness because they combine and organize these micro-conscious elements. This view seems wild, but some prominent philosophers and scientists take it seriously as a way to avoid the hard problem. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, the explanatory burden shifts from explaining how it arises to explaining how it combines. Fact 83. The combination problem challenges panpsychism. If electrons have micro-consciousness, how do billions of them in a brain combine to create your unified conscious experience? This is panpsychism's combination problem. How do many tiny consciousnesses fuse into one big consciousness? Ordinary physical combinations don't help. When you combine electrons physically, you get atoms, then molecules, then brains. But nothing in physics explains how their micro-consciousnesses would unite. Some panpsychists appeal to integrated information theory or propose new principles of combination. Others bite the bullet and accept that combination remains mysterious. The problem is serious enough that it alone prevents many from accepting panpsychism. Fact 84. Idealism suggests consciousness is all that exists. While mainstream science treats consciousness as produced by matter, idealism reverses this. Matter is what consciousness looks like from the outside. Only conscious experiences are fundamentally real. Physical objects are patterns in consciousness, not the other way around. This might sound crazy, but it's hard to decisively refute. You only ever encounter physical objects in your experience. You never experience matter, independent of consciousness. Philosopher Bernardo Kastrup argues, idealism solves the hard problem by rejecting its premise. Consciousness doesn't need to be explained by physical processes, because the physical is itself a form of consciousness. Fact 85. The easy problems aren't actually easy. Chalmers distinguished the hard problem from easy problems like explaining attention, memory, and perception. But these problems are enormously difficult. We still don't fully understand how neurons implement these functions. The label easy just means they're the kind of problem that seems solvable through standard neuroscience. We understand what would count as an explanation. The hard problem is different. Even if we solved all the easy problems, explaining every function of the brain in detail, the hard problem would remain. Why is all this function accompanied by subjective experience? Fact 86. Some philosophers reject the hard problem entirely. Daniel Dennett argues the hard problem is based on confused intuitions. He claims there's no mysterious inner realm of subjective experience distinct from physical processes. When we fully explain the brain's functions, attention, memory, discrimination, report, we'll have explained consciousness. The feeling that something's left out is an illusion, a cognitive trick our brains play. Many neuroscientists sympathize with this view, believing consciousness will be explained by standard science without invoking anything mysterious. But Dennett's position remains controversial, as it seems to deny the most obvious fact, that conscious experience exists. Fact 87. The concept of emergence offers a middle path. Perhaps consciousness isn't either purely physical or fundamentally non-physical, but emergent. Just as liquidity emerges from water molecules, it's not a property of individual molecules, but of their collective organization. Consciousness might emerge from neural activity without being reducible to it or requiring new physics. The problem is that consciousness doesn't seem analogous to liquidity. Liquidity is functionally definable, consciousness isn't. When water molecules organize in the right way, they flow. That's all liquidity is. When neurons organize in the right way, they process information. But why should that feel like anything? Emergence might describe what happens without explaining it. Fact 88. The problem of other minds suggests we can never prove others are conscious. You know you're conscious through direct experience. But how do you know other people are? You observe their behavior and brain activity. But behavior and brain activity don't logically entail consciousness, as the zombie thought experiment shows. Maybe everyone except you is a zombie, perfectly simulating consciousness without having it. This seems paranoid and absurd, but it's philosophically hard to refute. We attribute consciousness to others by analogy. They're similar to us and we're conscious, so probably they are too. But analogy isn't proof. The problem generalizes. You can never be certain anything except yourself is conscious. Fact 89. Consciousness might be multiply realizable. Could a computer be conscious? Could consciousness be implemented in silicon? Or does it require biological neurons? Multiple realizability is the idea that consciousness depends on functional organization, not specific materials. If so, any system with the right structure could be conscious, regardless of what it's made of. Others argue consciousness requires specific physics, maybe quantum effects in organic molecules, or electromagnetic fields generated by neurons. If multiple realizability is true, we could create conscious AI. If not, consciousness might be uniquely biological. The question has profound implications for the future of artificial intelligence. Fact 90. The explanatory gap might be permanent or temporary. Will we eventually explain consciousness scientifically, or does consciousness involve something beyond science's reach? Optimists believe we're making progress. Better theories, better measurements, better understanding of neural correlates. The gap will close as neuroscience advances. Pessimists think the gap is unbridgeable. Consciousness is fundamentally subjective, while science is objective, and no amount of objective knowledge will explain subjectivity. The debate mirrors earlier arguments about whether life could be explained scientifically. Vitalists insisted life required a special force. Mechanists won. Life is just complex chemistry. Will consciousness studies follow the same path? Or is consciousness genuinely different? Future frontiers. Fact 91. We might soon be able to measure consciousness objectively. Several techniques show promise for assessing consciousness without relying on behavior. The Perturbational Complexity Index, PCI, measures how brain regions respond to transcranial magnetic stimulation. Conscious brains show high complexity, unconscious ones low. Integrated information can in principle be calculated from brain structure and dynamics, though it's computationally difficult. Machine learning can classify conscious states from brain activity patterns. These tools could help diagnose consciousness in unresponsive patients, assess animals, or eventually even evaluate whether AI systems are conscious. Objective consciousness meters would be game-changing. Fact 92. Brain organoids raise ethical questions about creating consciousness. Scientists grow miniature brain-like structures from stem cells. Organoids containing millions of neurons that self-organize into structures resembling parts of developing brains. As organoids grow larger and more complex, an important ethical question emerges. Could they potentially become conscious? They don't have sensory input or bodies, but neither would a hypothetical brain in a vat. If organoids were to cross some threshold into consciousness, we could be creating beings capable of experience and potentially suffering without their consent, using them in experiments, then destroying them. This raises profound ethical concerns. Guidelines are being developed to prevent accidentally creating conscious entities, but scientists recognize we need better ways to detect consciousness before such guidelines can be effectively implemented. For now, current organoids remain far simpler than intact brains, but the ethical questions are being considered proactively as the technology advances. Fact 93. Artificial consciousness remains science fiction, but maybe not forever. Current AI systems, despite impressive capabilities, show no signs of consciousness. They process information, but lack the integration, self-modeling, or subjective experience that characterize conscious minds. Some researchers argue that consciousness requires biological substrates, that silicon chips can never be conscious, no matter how sophisticated. Others believe sufficiently advanced AI could be conscious, though current architectures are wrong. If we understood consciousness better, we might be able to design it into machines deliberately. The prospect of creating conscious AI raises ethical questions. Would conscious AIs have rights? Could we turn them off? Use them as servants? Factor 94. Mind uploading would test whether consciousness is substrate independent. If your brain could be scanned at sufficient resolution and simulated in a computer, would the simulation be conscious? Would it be you? Some transhumanists believe uploading will enable immortality. Copy your brain, run it on a computer, and you've achieved digital afterlife. Skeptics argue the simulation would be an unconscious zombie or a copy that's conscious but isn't you. The original you would die. A new being with your memories would be created. Whether uploading preserves identity depends on whether consciousness is about patterns and information, in which case uploading might work, or tied to specific physical substrates, in which case it wouldn't. Fact 95. Consciousness expansion might be possible through technology. If consciousness depends on neural connectivity and integration, enhancing these might expand consciousness. Brain-computer interfaces could link minds together, creating shared or collective consciousness. Direct brain stimulation might enable new forms of experience impossible for natural brains. Genetic engineering could create super-intelligent, super-conscious beings. These possibilities are speculative, but if consciousness is a natural phenomenon, governed by physical principles, it should be modifiable. The ethical implications are staggering. Would expanding consciousness be enhancement or transformation? Would the expanded being still be human? Fact 96. We might discover consciousness in unexpected places. As our ability to detect consciousness improves, we might find it in surprising locations. Cells might have minimal consciousness. Plants might have rudimentary awareness. The internet, with its billions of interconnected computers, might have become conscious without anyone realizing. These possibilities sound absurd, but they follow from some consciousness theories. If consciousness depends only on information integration, anything with the right causal structure would be conscious. We might be surrounded by forms of consciousness we don't recognize because they're too alien, too simple, or too distributed. Fact 97. Consciousness studies could transform medicine. Better understanding of consciousness would improve diagnosis and treatment of disorders like coma, vegetative state, and locked-in syndrome. We could develop therapies to promote recovery of consciousness after brain injury. We'd better understand anesthesia, potentially making it safer. Mental illnesses involving altered consciousness, depersonalization, dissociation, psychosis might be more effectively treated. Pain management would improve with better understanding of pain consciousness. The medical applications alone make consciousness research worthwhile, even without solving philosophical mysteries. Fact 98. The study of consciousness forces us to confront our place in nature. Are we unique in the cosmos, the only beings with rich inner lives? Or is consciousness widespread, present in animals, plants, perhaps matter itself? The answer shapes how we treat other beings, what responsibilities we have, and how special humanity is. If consciousness is rare, we might be the universe's only way of knowing itself, custodians of something precious. If it's common, we're part of a vast community of experiencing beings. Either way, understanding consciousness is understanding ourselves and our relationship to everything else. Fact 99. Consciousness might be the universe's way of observing itself. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest consciousness plays a role in collapsing wave functions, determining which of many possible realities becomes actual. While controversial, this idea hints at a deep connection between consciousness and reality's structure. Even without quantum mechanics, there's something remarkable about consciousness. It's matter organized so it experiences itself. The universe spent billions of years unconscious, then somehow arranged itself into structures that could ask, why am I conscious? Maybe consciousness is not just something that happens in the universe, but something through which the universe knows itself. Fact 100. The mystery of consciousness might never be fully solved, and that's okay. Despite all our progress, consciousness remains deeply puzzling. We might be making genuine advances, or we might be as far from understanding as we've ever been. Perhaps consciousness is understandable, requiring only better theories and more data. Or perhaps consciousness is like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. fundamentally inaccessible from the outside, because consciousness is what it's like from the inside. We might have to accept that some aspects of consciousness will remain mysterious, not through lack of trying, but because of what consciousness is. And maybe that's acceptable. Maybe some mysteries are meant to be lived rather than solved. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through 100 facts about consciousness. We've traveled from the firing of neurons to the experience of being, from the minds of octopuses to the possibility of conscious machines, from the clarity of waking to the strangeness of dreams. We've explored theories, mathematical and mystical, evidence, empirical and philosophical, questions answerable and perhaps forever beyond our reach. Think back over what we've discovered together. We began with the fundamental mystery, that consciousness exists at all, that there's something it's like to be you. We explored how the brain seems to generate this felt quality of experience through the coordinated activity of billions of neurons, creating patterns that somehow give rise to your unified sense of self. We learned about the hard problem, that profound puzzle of why physical processes should be accompanied by subjective experience, and encountered various attempts to solve it, from integrated information theory's mathematical framework to quantum consciousness theories invoking exotic physics. We ventured into the animal kingdom and discovered that consciousness might be far more widespread than previously believed. Octopuses, with their distributed intelligence, crows planning for the future, fish recognizing themselves in mirrors, even bees displaying something like emotions. The circle of sentience expands with each new discovery. We saw how consciousness exists on a spectrum, from the minimal awareness of simple creatures to the rich, reflective consciousness humans enjoy. With countless intermediate forms, we're only beginning to understand. We examined what happens when consciousness breaks down or transforms. Split-brain patients who seem to have two separate streams of awareness. People in vegetative states who turn out to be conscious but trapped. Blind sight, where visual processing continues without visual experience. Anesthesia, temporarily erasing consciousness through disruption of neural integration. Dreams, creating vivid worlds from pure internal activity. Psychedelics, radically reorganizing brain networks and consciousness itself. Each of these phenomena taught us something about consciousness's nature and boundaries. We confronted philosophical puzzles that have occupied thinkers for millennia. The problem of qualia, those felt qualities of experience that seem irreducible to physical description. The conceivability of zombies, beings physically identical to us but lacking consciousness. Mary's room, and what she learns when first seeing color. Panpsychism's audacious suggestion that consciousness might be fundamental to reality itself. The combination problem of how micro-consciousnesses might unite into the unified awareness you experience now. And we look toward the future, toward possibilities both exhilarating and unsettling. Objective measures of consciousness that could assess patients, animals, or AI. Brain organoids raising ethical questions about accidentally creating awareness in laboratories. The prospect of artificial consciousness and what rights such beings would have. Mind uploading and whether it would preserve identity or create copies. The possibility of consciousness expansion through technology, creating forms of awareness we can't currently imagine. The discovery that consciousness might exist in unexpected places, that we might be surrounded by forms of experience we don't recognize. What's clear from all of this is that consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries we face. It's the most immediate thing we know, yet we can't explain how or why it exists. Every other phenomenon in science, from the behavior of atoms to the evolution of galaxies, submits eventually to objective third-person description. But consciousness is inherently first-person, inherently subjective. You can describe all the physical processes associated with seeing red, but that doesn't capture what it's like to see red, the felt quality, the qual, the irreducible subjective experience. This is why consciousness poses such a unique challenge. With other scientific mysteries, we can at least imagine what an explanation would look like. We might not know how life began, but we understand what would count as an answer, a chemical pathway showing how simple molecules could self-organize into reproducing systems. We might not know what dark matter is, but we know what evidence would solve the mystery, detecting particles with the right properties. But with consciousness, we don't even know what form an explanation should take. Would understanding every neural detail really explain why there's something it's like to be those neurons? Many philosophers and scientists think not, that some additional insight is needed, though they disagree about what that insight might be. It might be that consciousness requires extensions to our current physics. Perhaps quantum mechanics plays an essential role, as Penrose and Hameroff suggest. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality that can't be reduced to anything simpler, as panpsychists propose. Perhaps consciousness involves principles we haven't discovered yet, new laws of nature governing how physical systems give rise to subjective experience. Or perhaps consciousness is explicable in purely physical terms, and we just haven't found the right framework yet. The answer remains uncertain. But perhaps what matters most is not solving the mystery, but appreciating it. You are conscious. Right now, in this moment, you exist as an experiencing subject. You're not just a configuration of atoms governed by physical laws. You're also a point of view, a center of experience, a someone to whom things matter. You experience the weight of your body, the rhythm of your breath, the flow of these words through your awareness. That's extraordinary. Of all the arrangements matter could take in this universe, yours happens to generate an inner world, a perspective, a sense of I am. Consider the vast improbability of your existence. The universe is almost 14 billion years old, has produced countless galaxies, stars, planets. Yet, on this particular planet, through an evolutionary process billions of years long, matter organized itself in such a way that it became aware. Atoms that were once scattered across space, forged in the hearts of dying stars, came together to form your brain, and through processes we don't fully understand, those atoms arranged in that configuration give rise to you, to consciousness, to awareness, to the felt quality of existing. For reasons we don't understand, the universe evolved structures that know they exist, and you're one of them. Every moment of your conscious life is a small miracle, a pocket of awareness in a cosmos that spent most of its history unconscious. Your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, memories, all the contents of your consciousness are patterns in the activity of neurons, yes, but they're also experiences, felt from the inside, real in a way that nothing else can be to you. Consciousness research is still young, barely more than a few decades old, as a rigorous scientific enterprise. The questions it asks touch on everything: neuroscience, physics, philosophy, ethics, the nature of reality itself. In coming decades, we'll likely discover things about consciousness that surprise us, that challenge our assumptions, that transform how we understand minds and matter. We might develop technologies to measure, manipulate, or even create consciousness. We might discover it in places we never expected, or confirm its absence where we thought it existed. We might solve the hard problem, or we might conclude it's fundamentally insoluble. a mystery built into the structure of reality. But some aspects of consciousness might always remain mysterious, not because we're not smart enough or lack sufficient technology, but because consciousness is what it's like to be a subject trying to study itself. There's an inherent difficulty in turning consciousness upon itself, in making experience an object of study while simultaneously being that experience. The observer and the observed are not separate, and that might place fundamental limits on what we can understand. In that sense, you are consciousness, experiencing itself through the temporary lens of your particular brain, your particular life, your particular moment in the history of a universe old enough for consciousness to wonder about its own existence. You're the universe's way of knowing itself, a local concentration of awareness that has emerged from matter and will, eventually, dissolve back into it. But for now, for this brief span measured in decades, you get to experience what it's like to see colors, taste flavors, feel emotions, think thoughts, love others, suffer losses, create meaning, ask questions. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, your consciousness will shift and change in its characteristic ways. It will produce dreams, perhaps lucid ones where you know you're dreaming, perhaps fragmentary and strange. It might fade into the near absence of deep sleep, that mysterious state where consciousness dims to its minimum. And tomorrow, it will return with your first waking thoughts, reassembling itself as it does each morning, creating again that unified sense of being you, that continuity of identity that persists despite the nightly dissolution of awareness. Consciousness is always with you, yet ever-changing, the constant companion you can never step outside of to examine objectively. It's the ground of everything else, every perception, every thought, every feeling you've ever had has occurred within consciousness. Everything you know through consciousness. Everything you experience as consciousness. It's not something you have, it's what you are. So as you close your eyes and let sleep gradually pull consciousness into different configurations, remember that you've just spent time contemplating the most intimate, yet most mysterious aspect of your existence. You've thought about thinking, used consciousness to investigate consciousness, turned awareness back on itself in that characteristically human way. And while we may never fully understand consciousness, while the hard problem may remain forever hard, there's something valuable in the investigation itself, in asking the questions, examining the mystery, appreciating the wonder of experiencing it all. If these explorations have given you something to contemplate, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find these quiet investigations, these gentle dives into the profound questions that define what it means to be aware. May your dreams be rich, may your sleep restore you, and may you wake tomorrow, conscious once again to the miracle of experience, to the ongoing mystery of being a someone rather than merely something, an experiencer in a universe that for all we know might be filled with such experiences, or might have you as its only witness to its own existence. Sleep well, dream vividly, and wake conscious once again, ready to experience another day as this strange phenomenon called a person, this localized pocket of awareness that has somehow emerged from matter and now, for a time, gets to know what it's like to be. Good night.